This Chris was the original Chris Watts. I can't believe more people don't know about this case. Sherry and Chris Coleman met when she was just 21 years old. And despite his parents not really feeling like she was good enough for their son, the pair did get married and had their first child, Garrett, in 1998. They then welcomed their second son, Gavin, into the world in 2000. They lived in Columbia, Illinois, and the two children were absolutely adorable, as you can see. But they were primarily raised by Sherry due to how absent Chris was. He was constantly travelling for work, and therefore he left the responsibility of childcare on Sherry's shoulders, and she did a great job. As the years went on, in a striking resemblance to the Chris Watts case, Sherry actually started confiding in her friends that she just felt like Chris wasn't really that affectionate to her, he wasn't really giving her much attention, he'd started going to the gym a lot more recently, and she felt they were growing apart. Just as a quick interlude, he looks so much like a 90s cartoon character here, and I can't for the life of me think of which one it is, so please do help me figure it out in the comments. It's not Pinky in the Brain. I was feeling like it was something to do with like Pinky in the Brain, but some sort of like evil rat creature. I'm hoping you know who I'm on about. Again, just like Chris Watts and Shanann, the pair were also having financial issues, which just caused further tensions. It's not 100% clear how, but Sherry came to realise that her husband was having an affair, and I do feel like women just tend to have this like sixth sense with things like this. She just had a gut feeling, and she actually did work out even who this was. It was a woman called Tara Lintz who Sherry knew, and Sherry had even been the one to introduce the pair. Tara was apparently like an old school friend of hers. Men never fail to amaze me in just the worst ways. And interestingly, while Sherry and Chris were having these marriage issues, he started receiving random threatening emails and letters, which even threatened members of his family, which was extremely concerning. Now, these emails were apparently coming to Chris, this is the story he said, because he worked for a woman called Joyce Meyer, who was the president of Joyce Meyer Ministries, a Christian ministry essentially. And this mystery emailer apparently hated her, so was kind of like directing the threats at Chris and his family because Chris was the director of security. Bear in mind, this is Chris's story. So Chris reported this to police, and they seemed to be kind of keeping an eye on this. And on the 5th of May 2009, Chris seemingly headed off in his car to the gym like he normally did. This was very early in the morning, and he then later sent a text to his wife just asking if she was awake. Now, bearing in mind, he never usually did this. He never usually said like, are you okay, are you up, are you awake? So after his workout, he called her but got no answer, and seemingly concerned about his wife and children's safety, he made his way home to the family home, but also called the police on the way there. And officers headed over pretty quickly, and before Chris arrived back home, the police had already made their way into the property and found a horrific scene. They found really disturbing, menacing, spray-painted messages all over the walls. Things such as, "I'm watching" and "You're punished." Horrifically, Sherry and the kids were deceased inside the home. They'd all been strangled to death, which is an obviously extremely up-close and personal, violent and slow way to go. Now, Chris strangely took a lot longer to get home than he usually should have, so why had he been stalling? And interestingly, when he did get to the house and he made his way inside, the police told him to sort of step away, don't come inside, your family have been killed. And he didn't even think to ask how they'd been killed. It was almost like he already knew. Now, Chris eerily also had scratches on his arms, which when he noticed that these scratches were there, he started like flailing his arms around and banging his arms about, almost like he wanted it to look like that's how he got the scratches. He was taken in for questioning and was incredibly matter-of-fact in recounting the story of what had happened, considering he'd just found out his whole family was dead. He also strangely asked for a blanket because he was apparently cold, but when they gave him the blanket, he didn't actually put it round himself, he just kind of used this to cover up his arms. Now, police soon found out about the affair with Tara and brought her in to be questioned, and she told them a lot. She said the pair were planning a Caribbean cruise, they'd told each other they loved each other, Chris had told her he was divorcing his wife, they'd even discussed baby names. And Chris, before he knew that the police were talking to Tara, originally denied any of this. He said that he wasn't having an affair, there was nothing like that going on. But then he was kind of backed into a corner and did have to confess. Remember those threatening emails that he'd been receiving? Well, investigators traced the sender of the emails to Chris's own laptop. He'd been sending them to himself. CCTV of the home captured on the neighbors' cameras also proved that nobody had been to the house after Chris had left for the gym. He'd obviously committed the murders before he left. It was Chris that had spray painted those horrific messages around his own family home after murdering his own family. And his little boy Gavin was even lay on his bed deceased with FU sprayed on the bed covers. Like, how much of a sick person do you have to be to do that? The victims' autopsies also proved that Chris's supposed timeline did not really add up. Experts deemed that the victims had died between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m, so before Chris had left for the gym. Now, the local community were obviously heartbroken by these senseless murders, and they actually created a really lovely little vigil outside the family home with like photos and candles and things, but Chris callously just removed all of this and threw it away. He was charged with the murders, and at his trial, Tara testified. She confessed that the pair had had a physical affair, told each other they loved each other, as well as exchanging promise rings, and she very cold-heartedly wore her promise ring to the trial. Chris was found guilty and given 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. And sickeningly, Chris's parents very much tried to blame Sherry, the murder victim, for hers and her children's murders. They said she never complimented Chris. Wow. This has to be one of my all-time most requested crime cases ever. This is the reality TV killer, Mick Philpott. It was the 11th of May 2012 at 18 Victory Road in Derbyshire. 6 children were sleeping soundly in their beds when all of a sudden a huge fire broke out. Now, this fire was no ordinary fire. It almost felt like it just engulfed the whole house straight away. As smoke roared through the building, Mairead Philpott, the children's mother, rang emergency services. It seemed that the parents had been able to flee, but their dad Mick had apparently made heroic attempts to try and save the children. The dramatic scenes that unfolded almost felt like something out of an action film. It was like a theatrical spectacle that had been curated. And in a sick way, it had. But the consequences were deadly and very, very real. It wasn't long before the bodies of children inside the property were being carried out by emergency responders. Innocent little lives cut far too short. There was 5-year-old Jaden, 6-year-old Jesse, 8-year-old Jack, 9-year-old John, 10-year-old Jade, and 13-year-old Dwayne. 5 of them had died from smoke inhalation, and 1 was rushed to hospital and died at a later stage. And at first glances, you'd think Mick was a devastated dad. As the bodies were carried out by the responders, Mick actually had to be held back because he seemed so devastated. He was almost like lunging for his children's bodies. This appeared to just be a tragic accident, but the truth was soon revealed. Investigators quickly determined that this fire had been set intentionally, with petrol beneath the letterbox. And as the word started spreading about this horrific family tragedy, people started talking about Mick, the dad. It seemed his name was on everyone's lips. He was very notorious in the area. He was incredibly outspoken and provocative and had appeared on the infamous Jeremy Kyle show. He'd earned the nickname Shameless Mick and appeared on numerous TV shows over the years. He'd often brag about having 2 wives and was very obnoxious and aggressive on TV. It made people wonder, what's he like behind closed doors if this is what he's being like in public on national television? In fact, Mick had a very, very horrific and disturbing history. He'd been incredibly abusive towards women, including even attempted murder. He'd previously headbutted a female colleague, along with a sickening attack on a teenage girlfriend who had tried to break up with him. She was terrified of him as he'd previously not only broken her arm, but also dislocated her knee with a sledgehammer. And people always comment on my videos like, why do these women stay with these abusers? Well, because it usually gets much worse after they try and leave. And Mick did just that. When she said she was going to break up with him, he broke into her house, grabbed a knife, and stabbed her repeatedly in an attempt on her life. He then also turned the knife onto her mum. He was put in prison for this, but was then released, and his behaviour only escalated. And Mick was constantly having kids and not looking after them. He got married to his first wife but ran off with a 16-year-old girl. Bear in mind this man was in his 40s at this point. He then ended up with Mairead, the mother of his deceased children. And after that horrific fire, they went on to do a press conference. Now, reporters were expecting, understandably, the Philpotts to sit there and ask for anybody with any information to come forward. You'd think that they would want to find whoever did this, whoever was responsible, and punish them. What the Philpotts actually did was just sit there thanking people. They didn't appeal at all for any information, and in fact Mick only asked one thing: to be left alone. Mick was kind of seen throughout the press conference holding this piece of scrunched up tissue. He was dabbing his eyes with it, but there were clearly no tears coming out. It almost seemed like a prop just to show that he was upset, because half the time he had it on his forehead. And it wasn't just this that was making police incredibly suspicious. Neighbours from across the road reported to police that they'd seen Mick during the fire outside pretending to cough, not rescue his kids. Police now had enough suspicions to try and set a trap to catch the Philpotts out. They were keeping them in a hotel because obviously the house had burnt down, but this was a great opportunity to try and get some evidence. They decided to bug the room that they were in. Shockingly, they caught Mick interrogating his wife about how convincing she'd been when she was lying to police. It also transpired that a friend of the pair, Paul Mosley, was also involved in the planning of this fire. Shortly after the tragedy, locals had also spotted Mick and his wife in a pub singing karaoke, dancing and getting drunk, which was incredibly strange for two people who'd just lost multiple children. Nurses had also reported how inappropriate Mick was in the hospital, where his son was fighting for his life on a life support machine. Now, this was just before his son passed away. Mick had been making inappropriate comments to nurses and trying to flirt with them. The true story of what had led to the horrific deaths is purely down to Mick Philpott wanting to seek revenge on an ex and gain financially. It transpired that in early 2012 he was desperate to get a bigger council house after one of his wives had left him and taken her 5 children. He seemingly wanted to do something to get back at her and set the fire to try and frame her. He had envisioned getting her into trouble with the authorities so that he could have custody of her children and therefore have a bigger council house. He also thought that he would be this brave hero and the world would love him. He set this fire with complete disregard for the children's safety, and they went through unimaginable suffering at the end of their short lives. The local community really kindly raised over £15,000 for the children's funerals, but Mick was really not that interested in this. He was more interested in auctioning off the teddy bears that had all been left at the front of the house. He wanted to keep the money and told one organiser, "Shut up and just get on with it." Mick got given life in prison, and Mairead and Paul got just 17, and I believe that they're now both free.